Wells of Silence by TheBeckster, Chapter 18. Anakin knew Obi-Wan wouldn't be able to keep his promise. She knew the council would find out the whole truth. Frankly, she hadn't exactly been making an effort to pretend everything was fine either. Anakin had spent the last 3 days after the twins' birth resting at home, spending time with her husband and children. She hadn't bothered trying to go back to the temple or make contact with anyone other than Obi-Wan. She knew a confrontation was coming. It was inevitable. She just wasn't sure how it would come. A summons to the temple for trial, a handful of masters and knights storming her home to take her and her family into custody, Obi-Wan sent as a decoy to lure her away from her children so they could be kidnapped. The longer she thought about it, the more outrageous the imagined situations became. She found herself dwelling on the possibilities more than she cared to admit. Even Padme took notice, and he would gently try to prod her away from her thoughts. By the time Master Yoda and Windu came to her, she was surprised it was only them. By this point, she had been expecting half the council, a few knights, and some clones for good measure to ensure her cooperation. When C-3PO guided the Jedi back to the nursery, Anakin found herself quite startled. For one, she hadn't even sensed them approaching. That was on her. She had learned to rely on her oversensitivity too much over her pregnancy. She was out of practice, and secondly, the masters were both exiting a sense of non-aggression. She knew a confrontation was inevitable, but she could sense they weren't here to take her or her children at this very moment. Knight Skywalker, much to discuss. We have. Anakin's arms tightened instinctively around the bundle in her arms. She had just finished feeding the twins, and Luke liked being rocked to sleep after a meal. Leia did too, but she seemed to prefer Padme's arms. Neither of the twins were quite asleep yet, and Anakin knew if they were put in the crib, they would be crying again in a few minutes. 3PO, please show our guests to the veranda. We will be out in a minute, Padme instructed, seemingly unfazed by the presence of the Jedi Masters. Of course, Master Padme. The droid bowed to his owners before turning to the Jedi. Please follow me. The Jedi followed the droid without protest, and Anakin heard him offer to procure any refreshments. Annie, Padme turned to his wife. His calm mask had fallen, and there was a slight tremor in his voice. Anakin took a measured breath and released a long sigh as she stood up. We might as well get this over with. And the twins? She looked at her children. They were both wide awake, but quiet, no doubt sensing something, but unable to comprehend what it was. They'll only cry if we leave them here. Padme reached out and took his wife's hand. He shook slightly, but she gave him a reassuring squeeze, and as a family they walked to the veranda to face whatever came next. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air as they took a seat on the couch across from the Jedi Masters. Neither Anakin nor Padme were willing to break it. The Masters were studying the family with critical eyes. Anakin steeled herself and matched Windu's glare. She wouldn't be cowed in her own home, and certainly not by Mace Windu. Still, she waited for the Jedi to speak. They had come to her after all. Mace was the first to break the silence. Master Kenobi said you and the children were well. Yes, Anakin was somewhat thrown, but she kept her tone neutral. Windu had shown little to no concern for her or her children during her entire pregnancy. He had opted for cool distance instead. Clearly, this whole situation was as off-putting for him as it was for her. You understand that you are in direct violation of the Jedi Code, Skywalker. Anakin didn't bother with a response. They all knew the code. They were all aware of Anakin's violations. Yoda narrowed his eyes at her. Disobeyed direct orders from the council. You have. Deliberately misled the council. You have. Irresponsible and dishonest. You have been. Is this a trial? Anakin snapped at Master Yoda. She didn't need him to read off the litany of crimes she had committed against the council. She was there, she had lived them, though in her opinion getting married and having children was pretty low on the list of punishable offenses. It wasn't like she had murdered Jedi or fallen to the dark side or committed treason. No, your trial will be forthcoming, Mace took over explaining. When the war is over and the full council is present. Anakin nearly snorted. That might take a while, she said derisively. Even now, when the evidence was so clear, the council would still drag things out and beat around the bush. You misunderstand. The trial is a formality. You cannot have this. Windu gestured to her family and around her home. And still call yourself a Jedi. Anakin clenched her jaw and ducked her head so she was expelled. They had made the decision without giving her the chance to defend her actions, plead her case, or prove to them she was invaluable as a Jedi Knight. She had hardly expected mastership or a seat on the council or any special accommodations from the Jedi after the truth came out, but she wasn't expecting them to expel her without a trial. Hot flames of anger flickered through Anakin's chest. Even Voss had gotten a fair trial before judgment was passed, and he had murdered Jedi and fallen, and yet the council couldn't be bothered to extend her the same right as a knight that he had? Luke squirmed and cooed and looked directly into her eyes. They were soft and clear and blue. The rage died down immediately. She didn't need the Jedi. She had her husband and her children. The Jedi were just the crutch she had been using ever since she left Tatooine as a child. But she could stand her own now. Fine, she hissed. Padme squeezed her hand and leaned against her. Anakin looked to their daughter and then to her husband. What happens in the meantime? She asked, turning back to the Jedi. On probation. Until the trial, you will be, Yoda explained. You ain't in command. You lose. Your privileges in the temple, you lose. Spend time recovering. And with your family. You should. I understand. The Jedi Masters rose to their feet. Anakin didn't bother showing them the respect of standing with them. They had come into her home unannounced. They could see themselves out. We will be in contact, Skywalker, Mace Windu said, and coming from him, it almost sounded like a threat. Anakin scowled up at him. Next time, just send a messenger droid. Save yourself the trip. The Masters had no further words for her. C-3PO showed them to the door. Anger boiled through Anakin's veins as soon as they left. It distressed the twins, and they wailed at this sudden upset. Here, Annie, let me put them down, Padme offered quietly, slipping Luke into the crook of his other arm. Anakin let him go. He had a more soothing touch with the twins, and she knew that she wouldn't be able to quell her anger long enough to let the twins fall asleep. They needed space from her raw emotions if she wanted them to be happy. That realization didn't make her feel any better. What kind of mother was she if she couldn't even control her emotions well enough to take care of her own children? Her hands shook. She clenched them into tight fists. When that didn't stop the shaking, her anger flared hotly. She seized a small porcelain sculpture off a table and threw it against the wall with all her might. It shattered into a million satisfying pieces. Anakin seriously considered finding another little figurine to take her anger out on, and another until she was all burnt out. But 3PO shuffled back onto the veranda at the sound of shattering porcelain. He fused over the broken sculpture and the peculiarity of it breaking so far from its usual place, and the fragility of the porcelain in the first place. Really, he had told Master Padme that the sculpture was clearly a cheap imitation of the original work. Privately, he had always thought it was a bit tacky. Of course, he would never dare to say such things to his master, but he wasn't unhappy to see it go. By the time the droid had every fragment, shard, and particle swept up and disposed of, Anakin's anger had simmered down to a low burn in her stomach. She threw herself down onto the couch and massaged her temples. Trying to will her anger away entirely, it flared slightly when a speeder approached the veranda. She stalked over to the security curtain controls, half contemplating turning them onto high security mode. "I'm seriously considering not letting you in," she growled to the visitor. Obi-Wan pursed his lips and swallowed nervously as he stepped up to the slightly flickering energy curtain. "They already came, didn't they?" "Don't act like you were trying to come and warn me about their visit." Anakin's hand hovered over the controls. "It would be easy. She just had to flip a switch and Obi-Wan would get a rather nasty and quite deserved shock." "It won't do you any good, Anakin. I know the security code," Obi-Wan said casually, failing to mask the unease that seemed to be settled over him. "What if I change the codes? I know all your favorite passcodes, too." It was an attempt at a joke, a very weak one. Anakin just scowled at him. Obi-Wan sighed softly. "Can we talk, Anakin?" "We can talk just fine like this." Even as she said it, her fingers moved to dispel the screen. She turned away as the screen dissipated and walked back to the couch. She tried to hide the fact that she still was sore and stiff, but she also knew that Obi-Wan would see her limp. At least she was able to sit down without a pained groan. "How are you recovering?" Obi-Wan asked hesitantly, following her to the couches. "Don't," Anakin snapped, her voice icy. The last thing she wanted from him was pity and feigned concern. Obi-Wan wasn't going to be cowed so easily. "You knew they were going to discover the truth, Anakin. You knew this was coming." "You didn't have to be the one to tell them." Obi-Wan frowned at her, but didn't deny it. His betrayal was inevitable. "What did they decide?" "You're on the council, you know." "No, Anakin, I don't," he said softly. "I was not included on the council decision. I'm too close to this." "You haven't lost your seat, have you?" The question came out before she could catch it. She wasn't a Jedi anymore. Their business no longer concerned her, and with all that had happened, with all they had done to her, didn't she deserve to be a little selfish right now? Why should it matter to her what happened to Obi-Wan? "No, I haven't." Anakin bit her lip, relieved that Obi-Wan wasn't taking a fall for her actions. But his visit wasn't about that now, was it? "Why are you here?" "I'm here to say goodbye." "Goodbye?" "I'm going to Mandalore." "You're being sent away?" "No." "Then what's on Mandalore? Why would they send you back?" "Maul." Anakin scowled on instinct at the name. She couldn't help it. That ex-Sith had been a shadow on their lives ever since she met Obi-Wan. He was responsible for Qui-Gon's death. He was responsible for Satine's death, 14 years gone, and she never would have imagined he would have come back from the dead to wreak havoc in their lives again. It's time for him to die, she growled icily. This isn't about him, Anakin. This is about liberating Mandalore. Maul is a criminal, a murderer. He will face justice, but he has been corrupted by the dark side. It is not a Jedi's place to play executioner. Surely you haven't forgotten already. Anakin turned her glare toward her former master. That was unfair. Obi-Wan blinked and looked away. Sorry. When do you ship out? In an hour. You should get going then. I'm sure you still have plenty to do before you go. The dismissal wasn't as icy as her tone had been, but it was still cold. Obi-Wan chose to not comment on it. Rather, he got to his feet. I should. Take care of yourself, Anakin. Anakin stood up as well. You too, Obi-Wan. Good luck on Mandalore. May the Force be with you. And you, Anakin. Obi-Wan turned back toward his speeder. I'll see you when I return, he promised before he flew off back to the temple. End of chapter.